Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.
A massive crimson moon hung low in the sky, its ghostly light filtering through a canopy of auroral veils that danced across the heavens. The combined illumination turned the bleached arena floor into a glowing trap. The ancient limestone, worn smooth by centuries of blood and sand, radiated heat in visible waves. Above, thousands of spectators sat motionless in tiered seating, carved from the same stone as the arena. A massive bowl cut from the planet's flesh. Their varied skin tones, blues, greens, mottled grays, caught the eerie light, but their eyes remained fixed on the arena floor, silent, unblinking. Rain Kell walked with his head bowed, each step measured and deliberate despite the scorching sand that burned through the thin soles of his worn leather boots. His breath came shallow in the oppressive heat. Sweat traced lines through the dust caked on his skin, stinging as it found the fresh welts on his back, where the guard's neural whips had left their mark. His shoulders, once broad and powerful, now stooped with exhaustion after weeks in the holding cells beneath the arena. The guard behind him, tall, with scaled skin the color of burnished copper, prodded Rain forward with the butt of a shock staff. "Don't look up," the guard hissed, voice barely audible over the eerie silence of the crowd. "She doesn't like disrespect. Keep your eyes down if you want to live even a few moments longer." Rain said nothing. His silence was not submission. It was conservation. Every ounce of energy mattered now. The massive iron gates before him groaned open, revealing the full expanse of the arena. The sand within was not the natural red gold of the planet's deserts, but bleached white, a canvas for the blood soon to be spilled. In the center stood a tall, blue-skinned woman. Her posture was sharp, like a drawn bow. Elegant, but deadly, poised on the precipice of violent release. Metallic armor traced her form, not in the functional plates of a soldier, but in jagged, ritualistic patterns that spoke of tradition and rank. The armor itself seemed to capture and amplify the sun's light, making her glow like a vengeful star fallen to earth. Her face remained impassive, high cheekbones and slitted eyes betraying no emotion. The crowd's silent reverence suddenly made sense. She was not merely a warrior, but something akin to a living religious icon. Two swords rested in her hands, not the crude, heavy blades Rain had seen in the practice arenas, but elegant weapons with edges that caught the light like slivers of mirrors. They were extensions of her arms, balanced perfectly in her grip, the product of a lifetime of training. No speech, no introduction. The silence of the arena was complete, broken only by the whisper of sand beneath Rain's feet as he stepped forward. Then without warning, she lunged. The movement was so swift that many in the crowd missed it entirely. One moment she stood motionless, the next she was a blur of blue skin and flashing metal. Sand flew into the air as her feet propelled her forward with inhuman speed. Her blades sliced through the heat like lightning, one high, aimed at Rain's neck, the other low, sweeping toward his abdomen in a perfect killing stroke designed to separate head from shoulders while disemboweling in the same motion. The crowd inhaled as one, a collective gasp that seemed to pull the very air from the arena. Rain didn't dodge. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink as death hurtled toward him. Instead, with a calm that bordered on the supernatural, he lifted one hand and caught both blades by their edges. The metal bit deep into his palms. Blood immediately welled up, bright crimson against his sun-darkened skin, streaming down his wrists and dripping onto the white sand. But the swords stopped as surely as if they had struck stone. And in that moment, as his blood touched the metal of her blades, the world around Rain seemed to blur. He was a boy again, 8 years old, crouched amid the smoking ruins of a settlement on the outer colonies. Screams and weapons fire echoed in the distance. A blue-skinned woman stood over him, her back to him, her posture defiant as she faced armed figures in ceremonial armor. Words in a language he didn't understand, harsh, accusing. The woman's voice, softer but firm, pleading, then a blade flashing in the half-light. She moved with impossible speed, placing herself between him and the blade. The sound of metal striking flesh, a wet, terrible sound he would never forget. As she fell, he saw the symbol on her hand, palm out, fingers flat, the same gesture she had made moments before to her attackers. Blood pooled beneath her, soaking into the dust. Her eyes, yellow with vertical pupils, found his. Live, she whispered in his language. Remember. And then she was gone, leaving him alone with the killers who had come for them both. But they had hesitated then, confused by the symbol she had made. They'd left him alive, a mercy he never understood. Until now. The warrior froze mid-motion, her momentum arrested so completely that she nearly lost her balance. Her eyes, yellow with vertical pupils like a cat's, widened in shock. The crowd didn't breathe. The sound of his flesh gripping the blades was audible in the silence. A wet, grinding crunch as the metal bit deeper with each heartbeat. Steam rose where his hot blood met the cool metal. Rain's breathing remained steady, measured, while the warriors came in short, confused bursts. He looked her in the eyes, holding her gaze with the same immovable force that held her blades. In her face, in the particular angle of her cheekbones, the specific yellow hue of her eyes, he saw echoes of a woman who had died protecting a human child decades ago. Now, Rain said quietly, his voice carrying in the perfect silence of the arena, you'll learn why that was a mistake. The warrior stared at him, her composure shattered. This wasn't how the ritual was supposed to unfold. The condemned never survived the first strike. They ran, they dodged, they begged. Some fought back with desperate, doomed courage. But no one had ever simply stood and caught her blades as if they were toys offered by a child. She hadn't countered. He hadn't even tried to win, hadn't attempted to disarm her or strike back. And yet he stood, holding her twin blades by their sharpened edges, unmoving as stone while his blood ran freely. What are you? She whispered, her voice betraying both fear and awe. Rain's response was simple. He let go. Her swords dropped into the sand with a soft thud that echoed in the unnatural quiet. The arena stayed still, thousands of spectators frozen in disbelief at the broken ritual. The warrior's hands trembled slightly, not from exertion, but from the shock of the impossible. Then she did the unthinkable. She stepped back and raised her left hand, palm out, fingers flat, in a formal gesture that seemed to carry immense weight. Gasps rippled through the stands, followed by murmurs that grew like an approaching storm. The guard beside the gate muttered in horror, "No, that's the sign. That's not supposed to happen." Rain stood still, blood pooling at his feet. "What sign?" he asked, his voice calm, despite the pain that must have been radiating from his lacerated hands. The warrior lowered her hand, but her voice trembled when she spoke. "Only those who survive without striking are marked as returned. It's ancient, sacred." Her eyes searched his face. "You just triggered a vow that's thousands of years old. You're not supposed to be able to." He looked up at the thousands of faces staring down at them, at the twin suns beating mercilessly on the arena. "Then your rituals are broken," he said simply. But behind them, alarms began to wail. Not the primitive horns or gongs one might expect in this setting of ancient ritual, but something electronic and urgent, a jarringly modern intrusion into the ceremonial space. The arena's top gate opened with a grinding of mechanisms. A new procession entered, moving with military precision. Warriors in ceremonial armor of gray and red, weapons held at ready positions, faces hidden behind polished masks that reflected the sun's glare. At the front walked a towering figure in elaborate robes of deep crimson, overlaid with polished armor plates inscribed with symbols of authority. A mask of burnished metal concealed all but the eyes, cold, calculating eyes that took in the scene with barely contained fury. The cast warden had arrived. Rain was seized by 4 guards, their scaled hands gripping his arms with bruising force. He didn't resist as they dragged him toward the darkness of the gate that led to the underground barracks. Blood marked his path across the white sand, a crimson trail that seemed to accuse those watching. The blue-skinned warrior, Captain Sealea of the trial cast, as murmurs in the crowd named her, didn't fight as 2 guards flanked her. She simply watched Rain being dragged away, her face a mask of confusion and something deeper, something like recognition. Inside the cool darkness beneath the arena, the council guards didn't strike Rain, though their posture suggested they wanted to. They surrounded him with silence and stares, their scaled skin catching the dim light of the phosphorescent panels embedded in the stone walls. "You embarrassed her," one finally said, a tall guard with facial ridges that marked him as a member of an elder bloodline. Rain sat on a stone bench, his lacerated hands untreated, blood still seeping. "I didn't mean to," he answered, eyes downcast. "I stopped dying. That seems to upset people here." They didn't like that answer. One guard hissed, a sound like steam escaping a pressure valve. Another simply turned away in disgust. Elsewhere in the complex, Sayalaya was escorted to an isolation chamber, a small, austere room with nothing but a metal bench and a water basin. The caste elders wanted answers before determining her fate. Why did she retreat? Why didn't she finish him? Why did she raise the sign of return? And she had no answers she could say aloud. Nothing that wouldn't sound like madness or heresy, because her hands were still shaking hours later. Not from fear, though fear was there, but from recognition. Something in the human's eyes had triggered memories, not her own, but ancestral memories, passed down through the bloodline of her caste, stories of the time before the castes, before the arenas, when outsiders had come to their world and changed everything. She sat alone in the darkness, trying to understand what she had seen in that moment when his blood ran over her blades. The chamber of the caste court stank of power, a combination of incense meant to evoke ancestral presence, the metallic tang of ceremonial armor, and the unmistakable odor of fear that emanated from all who were brought before the council. Rain was dragged forward in chains, his hands now roughly bandaged but still seeping blood through the crude wrappings. The floor beneath him was polished stone, ancient and worn by countless feet. The walls rose to a domed ceiling where light filtered through colored glass, casting patterns that shifted as the twin suns moved across the sky. Across from him, Sayalaya knelt on a circular platform, her head bowed. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen nearly shut. Her armor, once pristine, was cracked in several places. She had clearly been made an example of already. 12 figures sat in a semicircle on raised seats of carved stone, the caste elders, their faces hidden behind ceremonial masks. But at the center, on a seat slightly higher than the rest, sat the warden, now without his mask, revealing a face carved by age and hardened by power. His skin was the deep blue of ancient bloodlines, marked with ritual scars that proclaimed his rank and lineage. "You interfered with a sacred rite," the warden spoke, his voice resonating in the chamber. "You caught her blades. You stopped the sequence." Each statement felt like a hammer stroke. Rain stood straight despite his chains, meeting the warden's gaze. "I didn't interfere," he answered calmly. "I defended myself." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. One elder slammed a metal-clad fist against the arm of his chair. Another hissed a word that needed no translation to convey its vulgarity. The warden struck a ceremonial gavel against a sound block, the crack echoing through the space. "Do you know what the sign means?" the warden demanded. "No," Rain answered simply. "Then you gave it falsely," the warden concluded, satisfaction evident in his tone. Rain's eyes moved to Sayalaya, still kneeling, still silent. Slowly, she raised her head. Her unbruised eye met the warden's gaze with a defiance that seemed to surprise even her. "No," she said, her voice rough but clear. "He didn't give it falsely. He couldn't have." She took a breath. The sign of return can only be recognized by one trained in the trial caste. He couldn't have known, which means it was real. The chamber silenced, as if all sound had been sucked from the air, then exploded. Shouts, accusations. One elder rose to his feet, pointing at Sayalaya, spittle flying as he denounced her as a heretic. Another called for immediate execution of both prisoners. A third demanded the ancient texts be consulted. In the chaos, someone, a junior member of the caste guard, stepped forward and struck Sayalaya across the face with an armored hand. She fell sideways, blood spraying from her split lip. Rain lunged instinctively, only to be pulled back by his chains, the metal cutting into his already wounded wrists. Fresh blood trickled down his hands. The warden rose, and the chamber fell silent once more. He stepped down from his elevated seat and approached Rain, studying him as one might study an insect before crushing it. Then he pointed at Rain, his long finger nearly touching the human's chest. "If the rite was real," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "then let it be completed in full." His eyes narrowed. "Tomorrow at dawn, he will enter the second arena. He'll die in truth." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of reaction through the chamber. Even the elders seemed taken aback. The second arena was rarely used, a place of final judgment, not ritual combat. That is not the way, one elder began, but fell silent at the warden's glare. The way is what I declare it to be, the warden said. Then to the guards, take them away, separate cells, no contact. That night in his cell, a small chamber cut from the living rock beneath the arena complex, Rain sat on a hard pallet, his back against the cool stone wall. The only light came from a small phosphorescent panel near the ceiling, casting everything in a sickly green glow. His wrists were raw where the chains had cut them, adding to the wounds on his palms. No one had offered to treat his injuries. The bandages were stiff with dried blood. The sound of the outer door opening echoed in the stone corridor. Footsteps approached, lighter than the guards, more measured. The cell door swung open. Sayalaya entered. No guards accompanied her. She carried no weapons. Her face was still bruised, but the bleeding had stopped. She had changed from her ceremonial armor into simpler attire, a tunic and leggings of dark material that seemed to absorb the meager light. She stood in silence as studying him. "Why didn't you kill me?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rain looked up at her. "Because you weren't trying to kill me." She stared at him, confusion evident in her expression. "What do you mean? I attacked with killing blades." "You attacked because it was expected, because it's your role." Rain shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounds. "But your heart wasn't in it. I could see it in your eyes." "You know nothing of my heart," she said, but there was no conviction in her words. "They'll send you to the second arena," she continued after a moment of silence. "That's not a fight. That's a butchering." "Then they'll get what they want," Rain replied, his voice flat. "Or you could run," she suggested, gesturing vaguely toward the corridor. "I could arrange it." He looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the proud set of her shoulders despite her injuries, the defiance still burning in her eyes despite the consequences she had already faced. "You're not running," he observed. "Because I still believe there's something left worth standing for," she answered, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. He nodded slowly. "Then I'll stand for it too." She opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it. After a moment, she simply nodded in return and left, the cell door closing behind her with a finality that echoed in the stone chamber. The second arena was smaller than the first, but deeper, a pit rather than a stage with walls that rose steeply to a narrow viewing area. No ordinary spectators here, only elite caste warriors, each carrying real weapons rather than the ceremonial blades used in public displays. Their faces were grim, many marked with the tattoos of those who had killed in the name of caste justice. There were no rules here, no ritual, only blood and endings. Rain stepped into the circular fighting space at the bottom of the pit. The ground was not sand, but packed earth, dark with old stains. The crimson moonlight filtered weakly through a latticed roof far above, creating patterns of shadow and light that shifted as auroral waves passed overhead, bathing everything in a ghostly, shifting glow. He wore what he had been given, a simple tunic, no armor, no weapons. His bandaged hands hung at his sides, the wrappings now fresh but already showing spots of red where his wounds had reopened. At the far end of the circle stood the warden himself, now clad in battle regalia, armor of polished metal plates overlapping like scales, a helmet that left only his eyes visible, and in his hands a weapon that seemed designed for maximum pain, rather than clean killing. A blade with serrated edges that caught the light wickedly. "You dared touch the sign," the warden hissed, his voice distorted by the helmet's mouthpiece. "Then touch death." Around the upper rim of the pit, a few dozen observers stood in silence. Among them, near a narrow entrance, stood Sayalaya. She was unarmed, her face still bearing the marks of yesterday's punishment, but her back straight, her eyes alert, watching. A gong struck somewhere above, a single pure note that hung in the air. The warden charged. Rain didn't move. The warden's blade came down in a brutal arc aimed at Rain's shoulder, a strike meant to cleave through muscle and bone, to cripple before killing. Rain raised his arm and caught the blade mid-swing with one hand, gripping the searing metal edge just as he had done with Sayalaya's swords. He bled instantly. Crimson ran down his arm, dripping onto the dark earth. The sound of flesh meeting metal was visceral, wet and terrible. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, but his face remained calm, almost serene. The blade cut deeper with each pulse, but Rain's breathing never faltered. But the strike stopped. For a heartbeat, the warden stood frozen in disbelief. Then Rain twisted the blade with a sharp motion, wrenching it from the warden's grasp with a strength that seemed impossible from his lean frame. The crack of the warden's fingers, as they were forced open, echoed in the chamber. The weapon clattered to the ground between them, blood steaming on its edge in the cool air of the pit. A collective gasp rose from the observers. Rain stepped back, kicking the blade away. He turned slowly, addressing not the warden, but the room at large. "You want blood," he said, his voice carrying in the perfect acoustics of the pit. "Then come take mine, but earn it." The challenge hung in the air. The warden stood motionless, seemingly unable to process what had just occurred. Around the rim of the pit, the guards exchanged glances, uncertain. This was not how the second arena was supposed to function. There was no protocol for this situation. The warden finally moved, reaching for a secondary weapon at his belt, a short blade designed for close combat. "Kill him," he ordered the guards, his voice shaking with rage. The guards hesitated, looking at each other. None moved to enter the pit. Then Salaya stepped forward, approaching the edge of the pit. Without hesitation, she jumped down, landing gracefully on the packed earth despite the 10-foot drop. Her face was a mask of conflicted emotions. Duty warring with a deeper truth she was only beginning to understand. She bent to pick up the fallen blade that Rain had taken from the warden. She tested its weight in her hand, then looked at Rain. Their eyes met for a long moment. Something changed in her expression. Her grip on the sword tightened. For an instant, the pull of a lifetime of conditioning flickered across her face. The urge to finish what the warden had started, to eliminate this dangerous anomaly that threatened everything she had been raised to believe. She lunged forward, blade raised, but stopped just short of Rain's chest. He hadn't moved, hadn't raised a hand to defend himself. Just stood there, eyes fixed on hers, accepting whatever she chose to do. Her hands trembled. The blade's tip wavered inches from his heart. "Why won't you fight?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Because that's not why I'm here," he answered simply. She lowered the blade slowly, then turned and looked up at the warden. "You trained me to strike without hesitation," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But this man, this human, showed me how to stop." She raised the blade, holding it vertically before her face in a formal salute. But she didn't turn the blade on Rain. Instead, she kept it pointed upward, toward the warden and the assembled guards. "I no longer belong to this caste," she declared. She reversed her grip on the blade and dropped it at Rain's feet. Not as a weapon for him to use, but as a symbol of her rejection of everything it represented. A silent shockwave seemed to pass through the observers. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. The circle was broken, and for the first time, no one dared to redraw it. Then, one by one, others stepped forward. Not many, but enough. A young guard near the entrance removed his helmet and let it fall. An older warrior with ritual scars across his face nodded once, decisively, and turned his back on the warden. Two others simply walked away from their posts, disappearing into the corridor beyond. More swords dropped. Voices rose, some in support, others in outrage. "This is treason," shouted an officer, his hand on his weapon. Salaya looked up at him, then at the others who remained loyal to the warden. "No," she said simply. "This is truth." The next hours passed in a blur of action and reaction. The fracturing happened faster than anyone could have predicted. What had begun as Salaya's solitary act of defiance spread like fire through dry grass. Nearly half the caste guard declared themselves free of their oaths by sundown. The warden, seeing his authority crumbling, retreated to the high citadel with his most loyal followers. His silence in the days that followed, his refusal to address the growing rebellion directly, became a moral fracture that widened through the entire system. Those who had always followed without question suddenly found themselves without commands to obey. The vacuum his retreat created allowed doubt to flourish where once there had been only certainty. The arenas were sealed by those who remained faithful to the old ways. The ritual combats were suspended indefinitely. Throughout the city that surrounded the arena complex, rumors spread, evolving with each telling. Some said a demon had come to destroy the castes. Others claimed a prophet had returned from the stars to free them. Rain stood outside the chamber gates as twilight fell. watching as former enemies now worked together to barricade strategic points against a potential counterattack from the warden's forces. His hands were still wrapped in bloodied bandages, but the bleeding had finally stopped. Sayalaya approached, carrying fresh bandages and a small pot of ointment. Without a word, she began unwrapping his injured hands. "You should have these treated properly," she said, inspecting the deep cuts across his palms. "They'll scar." "I've had worse," he replied, watching as she applied the ointment, a greenish paste that smelled of herbs and minerals, to his wounds before rewrapping them with clean cloth. "You changed everything," she said, her eyes on her work. "In a single day, you broke what has stood for 1,000 years. He smiled slightly, the first time she had seen him do so. "I just stopped a sword." "Sometimes," she said, tying off the bandage on his right hand, "that's all it takes." She hesitated, then added, "You knew her, didn't you?" "My mother." Rain's face showed no surprise at the question. "I was a child when she died. She saved my life." "And now you've saved mine," Sayalaya said softly. "But why? Why come here at all?" "Because she asked me to remember," he replied, "and I did." She looked up at him, questions in her eyes that she didn't yet have the words to ask. But before she could speak again, a shout came from one of the barricades, a warning. "You didn't betray them," Rain said suddenly, as if sensing the guilt that still lingered in her. "They betrayed what you could have been." She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once and turned toward the sound of the alarm. That night, as most of the rebels slept, exhausted from the day's events, a shadow moved through the darkened corridors of what had once been the cast quarters. Vonin, a young guard who had been among the first to drop his sword in the second arena, crept silently toward Sayalaya's sleeping chamber, a thin blade clutched in his hand. He had sworn allegiance to the rebellion publicly, but his true loyalty remained with the warden, and with the substantial reward promised for Sayalaya's head. He eased the door open, eyes adjusting to the darkness within. A figure lay on the sleeping pallet, back turned to him, breathing the deep rhythms of sleep. Vonin raised his blade, only to find his wrist caught in an iron grip. Not Sayalaya's, but Rain's. The human had been sitting in the shadows of the room, silent and watchful despite his injuries. Now he twisted Vanin's arm with casual strength, forcing the would-be assassin to his knees as the blade clattered to the stone floor. Sayalaya woke instantly, rolling from her pallet and coming up in a fighting stance, only to find Rain already subduing her attacker. "He's the warden's," Rain said simply. "There will be others." The betrayal settled over the room like a physical weight. Vanin's face contorted with hatred as he realized his failure. "The caste will never fall," he spat. "Not to her treachery, not to your alien corruption." Sayalaya stepped forward, her face hardening. "The caste already fell," she said, "the moment it chose ritual over truth." After Vanin was taken away to be held with other prisoners, Sayalaya turned to Rain, seeing him in a new light. "You knew he would come." "I suspected someone would," Rain replied, wincing slightly as he flexed his injured hands. The wounds had reopened in the struggle. "Why protect me?" she asked. "After everything my people did to yours? To you?" "Because that's what she would have done," he answered simply. For 3 days after the incident, Sayalaya disappeared. No one knew where she had gone, and Rain offered no explanation, though many suspected he knew. Some feared she had defected back to the warden, others that she had been captured. On the morning of the 4th day, she returned. She looked different, harder perhaps, but also more certain. The ornate caste markings that had once adorned her armor were gone, burned away. In their place, a single symbol had been etched, a hand catching a blade. At her side walked a small child, blue skin like her, but with human eyes. One of the many half-bloods who had been kept hidden in the outer reaches of the city, neither accepted by the castes, nor welcomed among the few human settlers. "This is Terran," she said simply, introducing the child to Rain. "His parents died in the first riots. He stays with us now." Rain nodded, understanding the significance of what she had done, not just saving one child, but making a statement about the future she envisioned. 3 days later, as they ventured beyond the city's outer walls to establish contact with potential allies, a messenger found them, a young fighter who had once served under Sayalaya. "The warden!" the messenger gasped, having run for miles to find them. They found him in the High Tower. The High Tower was a ceremonial structure at the center of the caste complex, a needle of polished stone rising above the rest of the city, where only the most sacred rituals were performed. "He lives," Celia asked. "Barely," the messenger replied. He tried to complete the rite of final honor, the ritual suicide of a defeated warrior." Rain didn't need an explanation to understand the significance. They found the warden in a dimly lit chamber within the central citadel, surrounded by what remained of his loyal guard. He lay on a ceremonial platform, his chest bandaged, his breathing labored. The ritual blade, an ornate dagger with a curved edge, lay beside him, its surface stained with his blood. "He failed," one of the guards explained quietly as Rain and Celia entered. His hand trembled at the final moment. The cut wasn't deep enough. Celia approached the platform slowly. The warden's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her with difficulty. "You come to witness my shame," he rasped. "No," she replied. "I came to understand it." "There is nothing to understand," he said, each word an effort. "The caste is broken. I am broken with it." "The caste was always broken," she said. "We just couldn't see it." The warden's eyes moved to Rain, standing a few paces behind Celia. "You," he whispered. "You brought this. You caught the blade." "I did," Rain acknowledged. "How?" The question seemed torn from the warden's throat. "How did you know what it would do?" "I didn't," Rain said simply. "I just knew what it would mean." The warden closed his eyes. "Leave me to my failure," he said, "or finish what I could not." Celia reached down and picked up the ritual dagger. For a moment it seemed she might grant his request, complete the ritual that would give him an honorable end. Instead, she slipped the blade into her belt. "No," she said, "you will live to see what comes next. What we build from the ruins of your caste." They left him there, surrounded by the few who still clung to the old ways. A once mighty figure, now reduced to a symbol of a fallen order. As they walked from the citadel, Rain glanced at Celia. "Why spare him?" "Death would make him a martyr," she replied. "Life will make him a witness." 2 weeks later, they stood before the gates of Kalimvor, an independent city-state that had always maintained an uneasy relationship with the caste system. Unlike the central city, Kalimvor was a place of trade and mingling, where various species did business with little regard for hierarchy or tradition. Its walls were not the polished stone of ritual, but practical barriers of metal and composite materials, designed for defense rather than symbolism. Rain and Celia had come with a small delegation, former caste warriors and civilians who had joined their cause, seeking alliance against the remnants of the old order that still controlled several outlying settlements. The reception chamber of Kalimvor reflected its pragmatic nature, a functional space with simple decorations, tables arranged for conversation rather than dominance. The Trade Council, 5 representatives from the city's major factions, sat opposite Rain and Celia. "We understand your rebellion," said the lead counselor, a tall figure with mottled gray skin and eyes that reflected light like polished metal. "But Kalimvor has maintained its independence through careful neutrality." "Neutrality is no longer an option," Celia replied. "The old castes are weakened, but they'll regroup. When they do, they'll remember who helped them and who did not." "Bold words from one who wears caste armor, even with the markings removed," observed another counselor, a female with iridescent scales that shifted color as she moved. "How do we know this isn't simply one faction seeking to replace another?" "Because we're not seeking to rule," Rain said quietly, "only to end the rule of blades." The counselors exchanged glances. "Words," said a third representative dismissively. "We've heard many fine words from the castes before." Celia stood suddenly, her posture rigid. Without speaking, she removed her armored breastplate and turned it over. On its underside, hidden until now, was a symbol etched deeply into the metal, a spiral within a broken circle. The room fell silent. "The mark of the exiled," whispered the lead counselor. "You bear it?" "I claimed it," Celia corrected, "as my mother did before me." The mark of the exiled was ancient, older than the castes themselves. It represented those who had walked away from their people's path, choosing solitude over compliance. To claim it voluntarily was almost unheard of. "Your mother was Naravin," the female counselor said, recognition dawning in her eyes. "The one who fled with a human." "And died protecting him and their child," Celia confirmed. "I am that child." Rain looked at her in shock. This was a revelation he hadn't expected. Half-blood, the lead counselor murmured. Yet you rose within the caste. I hid what I was, Sayalaya said simply, until I could no longer hide from what it meant. The atmosphere in the chamber shifted. Calculation gave way to something like respect. The counselors conferred briefly in low voices. Kalimvor will open its gates to your people, the lead counselor announced, and we will consider your proposal of alliance. But know this, we protect our own interests first, always. As it should be, Rain acknowledged. We ask only for the chance to build something different, something better. As they left the chamber, Rain turned to Sayalaya. You never told me you were half human. Would it have changed anything? She asked. He considered this. No, he admitted, but it explains much. Like what? Like why you could see beyond the ritual, he said, even before I arrived. Their return journey to what had once been the caste city took them through the outer district, a labyrinth of abandoned structures that had once housed workers servicing the arena complex. Years of neglect had turned it into a wasteland of crumbling stone and twisted metal, avoided by most. Rain sensed the danger first, a shift in the air, the feeling of being watched. We're not alone, he murmured to Sayalaya. She nodded almost imperceptibly, her hand moving to the hilt of her blade. 2, she whispered, maybe 3. They continued walking, maintaining their pace while scanning their surroundings. The ambush, when it came, was swift and coordinated. 2 figures dropped from a ruined archway ahead, caste warriors in full battle regalia, their faces concealed behind ritual masks. A third emerged from a doorway to their right, blocking any retreat. Traitor, hissed one, his blade pointed at Sayalaya. The caste demands blood. Rain and Sayalaya moved instinctively, positioning themselves back to back. The caste demands too much, Rain replied calmly. Always has. The warriors attacked as one, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm. But Rain and Sayalaya were no longer bound by ritual combat forms. They moved fluidly, defensively, each protecting the other's blind spots. Rain caught the first warrior's blade with his newly healed hand, not gripping it this time, but deflecting it with a precise movement that sent the attacker stumbling past him. Sayalaya ducked under the second warrior's swing, coming up inside his guard with her own blade at his throat. The third warrior, seeing his companions neutralized, turned to flee into the maze of ruins. Go, Rain told Sayalaya. I'll handle these 2. She nodded and sprinted after the fleeing figure, disappearing into the shadows of a collapsed building. The pursuit led her deeper into the abandoned district, through narrow passages and across open courtyards littered with debris. The warrior she followed was fast, but Sayalaya knew these ruins from childhood explorations. She cut through a fallen section of wall, anticipating his path, and emerged ahead of him in a small circular space that had once been a private training ground. The warrior skidded to a halt, realizing he was trapped. He removed his mask, revealing a young face with ritual scars still fresh across his cheeks. Marin, Sayalaya said, recognizing one of her former students. Teacher, he acknowledged, his voice bitter. You taught us loyalty to the caste above all else. I taught what I was ordered to teach, she corrected. I was wrong. Then you admit your betrayal. He raised his blade. I admit I found a better truth. They circled each other in silence, the only sound the scrape of their boots on the debris-strewn ground. When they fought, it was without words, a dialogue of steel and movement, each reading the other's intentions through subtle shifts of weight and balance. Sayalaya knew his style intimately. She had helped shape it. She anticipated each thrust, each feint, and he, in turn, knew her traditional patterns. But Sayalaya no longer fought as the caste had taught her. Her movements were different now, influenced by Rain's unconventional style, freed from ritual constraints. Marin couldn't anticipate what he had never seen. The end came quickly, a sweep of her leg taking his feet from under him, the point of her blade at his throat as he lay on his back amid the dust and stones. Finish it, he said, closing his eyes, as the caste demands. Sayalaya lowered her blade. The caste demands nothing of me now, she said, or of you, unless you choose it. She stepped back, allowing him to rise. Go, she told him. Tell the others what you saw here. Tell them there is another way. They won't listen, he warned. Some will, she replied, as you might one day. He retrieved his blade, nodded once in acknowledgement, and disappeared into the ruins. When Sayalaya rejoined Rain, he had already disarmed and bound the other 2 attackers. Your pursuit? He asked. Ended, she said simply, with a choice. She hadn't stepped into a circle since that day, until now, and this time, she wasn't the only one on trial. Days later, as the first true reconstruction efforts began in what was now being called the Free City, Rain and Salaya walked through the ruins of the first arena. Much of the structure had been damaged during the uprising, sections of the tiered seating had collapsed, and the fighting pit itself was half filled with rubble. They picked their way carefully across the arena floor, now strewn with broken stone and bent metal. The white sand that had once covered it was mixed with debris, no longer a pristine canvas for ritual combat. Rain paused, bending to retrieve something from beneath a fallen section of seating. He brushed the dust away to reveal a fragment of metal, a broken piece of a blade, its edge still sharp despite being snapped off from its hilt. Yours, I think, he said, offering it to Salaya. From our first meeting. She took it, turning the fragment in her hands. The metal caught the light of the setting suns, reflecting it in a way that seemed almost alive. Not a weapon anymore, Rain observed. Just metal now. Salaya nodded. Let it remain blunt, she said quietly. We have enough edges in this world. She tucked the fragment into her belt, next to the ritual dagger she had taken from the warden. Tokens of a past that shaped her, but no longer defined her. As they continued their inspection of the ruined arena, Rain paused at the center, where the sand was still relatively undisturbed. Without explanation, he took his own blade, a simple, functional weapon without ornamentation, and plunged it into the ground, leaving it standing upright. What are you doing? Salaya asked. Making a monument, he replied. To remind us. Of what? That some things are worth stopping for. Weeks passed. The outer cities began to whisper of something new emerging from the chaos of the broken caste system, warriors without house or lineage, following no lord, only a code. They moved through the borderlands, intervening where the old powers fought to maintain control, protecting those caught in between. They wore no crests or colors to mark their allegiance, but their leader, whom whispers now called the Blade Catcher, bore distinctive scars across both palms. Some claimed he could not be killed by metal. Others said he was the vengeful spirit of all those who had died in the arenas. Few knew the truth, that he was simply a man who had chosen to remember a promise, and at his side a blue-skinned warrior woman whose armor now bore none of the traditional markings of her birth caste. Instead, a single symbol had been forged into her breastplate, a hand catching a blade. She carried her own memories of a childhood spent in the training pits where instructors would strike children who hesitated before killing, where thinking was beaten out, replaced by reflex and ritual, where she had once been praised for her perfect, thoughtless obedience, the same training that had failed her when she faced Rain in the arena. Behind them walked others, some from the former guard, some from the city's underclasses, even a few half-bloods once hidden away. And among them, always near Salaya, a small blue-skinned child with human eyes, learning the ways of both worlds. Rain carried 2 blades now. One was his own, simple, functional, rarely drawn. The other he kept wrapped in cloth, the second of Salaya's original twin blades from their first encounter. Not his to wield, he said, but his to keep until the day came when it would be needed again. At the center of what had once been the first arena, now abandoned by the old hierarchy, a single blade stood planted in the sand. Not as a threat or a challenge, but as a reminder. At its base, etched by hand in the stone of the arena floor, a symbol, not of war or caste or power, but of a hand gripping a blade, not to strike, to stop. And beside it, in smaller script, words in 2 languages, the flowing script of the castes and the angular text of human settlers, for those who stood between, for those who will stand again. The warden was never found after the fall of the caste system. Some said he had fled to the distant colonies. Others believed he had taken his own life, rather than live in a world without the old order. But every morning, as the crimson moon sets and the aurora fades, the blade in the arena is turned slightly, as if watched, or waiting. And sometimes in the deep night, Rain wakes with his scars burning, as if the metal is cutting into his flesh all over again. A warning, perhaps, or a promise. The game of blades is not yet over.